Amid the moss-covered walls of Kyoto's ancient capital, where ritual had become a thin mask, barely concealing the decay within, a boy of imperial blood grew up in silence. While Western gunships thundered off the coast, and the Tokugawa shogunate swayed in the winds of change, he neither cried for reform nor raised a sword in rebellion. Yet that very silence, over time, became thunder. He was neither a warrior nor a preacher. But Mutsuhito, later known by his era name, Meiji, would open the gate that led Japan out of feudal shadows and into a new age, modern, conflicted, and profoundly turbulent.
The article below has been compiled from many sources. If there are any mistakes, or if you know any interesting information, feel free to leave a comment so I can learn as well. Now, let's begin the article.
Beneath the ancient mask, the silent childhood of a heavenly sovereign. Born in 1852, in an era when imperial authority had been reduced to mere ritual, the boy Mutsuhito came into the world not to rule, but simply to exist. As a symbol, a quiet sun and moon suspended over the golden halls of the palace. The Kyoto court at the time moved as slowly as the rhythms of Buddhist scripture, each step measured in centuries. Yet beneath that seemingly immutable surface, the nation trembled in the gusts of a new wind. He grew up within the cold confines of the imperial palace, among lacquered wood and moss-covered stones, where the laughter of children was rarely permitted to cross the threshold. Concubines, court ladies, and ritual officials taught him everything necessary to become an emperor in the old mold: etiquette, calligraphy, classical poetry, Confucian doctrine. But no one taught him how to face the sounds echoing from the world outside. The gunfire in Kanagawa, the murmurs of treaties no one in court dared to name, or the whispers of southern daimyo quietly rising in defiance. Mutsuhito had no childhood in the true sense, and no right to choose his own fate. But he listened. He listened more than the adults imagined. He listened when his father furrowed his brow at reports from Edo, when envoys from Choshu or Satsuma bowed just a little too long in audience, when young scholars secretly passed around translations of Western books within the palace walls. No one could say for certain how much he understood, but in his eyes, those calm, dark eyes that never blinked too quickly, something was quietly taking shape. Not a rebellious fire, nor a thirst for power. Only a feeling, hard to name, like water slowly rising in an ancient well. No one sees it move, until the surface reaches the brim and reflects back the entire sky. A flash behind the curtain, when Mutsuhito ascended the throne. In 1867, when Emperor Komei died suddenly, while the tides of reform had yet to take shape, a chilling vacuum of power opened in the heart of the ancient capital. No tolling bell marked his passing. No morning chants rose in lament. Only the winter wind howled through stone corridors, and the hurried footsteps of courtiers echoed in the night, anxious, as if the world might collapse from a single breath that had ceased. The boy Mutsuhito, then just 15, who had never once chosen his own meal, was now called emperor. Upon his shoulders was placed the imperial robe, heavy not only with silk and embroidery, but with centuries of tradition, ritual, and the silent hopes of people he had never met. No one said exactly what an emperor should do, but everyone watched, wondering whether he could become a true symbol, or merely another fading name swept away by the flood of history. On the day of his enthronement, light rain fell over Kyoto. The deep red gates opened amid the damp mist, and the young man, whose face still carried traces of childhood, stepped onto the dragon throne. In the eyes of court nobles and feudal lords, there was doubt, expectation, and quiet resignation, some believing this was just another puppet raised amid the turmoil of the times. But Mutsuhito did not bow his head. Not out of pride, but because in that moment, for the first time, he realized he was no longer the boy hidden in the shadows, listening to the murmurs of the realm. Amid thousands of gazes, he looked straight ahead. No excess gesture, no unnecessary word. The rituals proceeded unchanged, but within their stillness, something had shifted. They say the dawn of a new era does not always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it is just a moment, a quiet gaze that does not flinch, a small step taken at the precise moment history trembles. And on that damp morning, Japan took its first step on a path with no return, a journey forever bound to the name Meiji, like a flash of lightning tearing through the night between two ages. The smoldering fire, beneath the throne, when the emperor was no longer a shadow. The teenage boy bearing the imperial title, Meiji, now sat upon the chrysanthemum throne. But like so many emperors before him, it remained a lofty seat in a cold room. Real power still rested in the hands of the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo. Edicts from the imperial court were read with solemnity, then scattered like leaves by the winds of the ruling hierarchy. Yet, within that stillness, something had begun to shift. Meiji did not speak much, nor did he issue grand proclamations in those early months. But the shrewd, especially the young lords from Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa, noticed something different in the young emperor's eyes. Not timidity, nor the passive submission of his predecessors. It was the gaze of someone quietly observing something long thought dead, the will of the throne. In the shadows of discreet councils, under the guise of casual tea gatherings, and buried within seemingly ceremonial petitions, a new web was spun. The Satsuma Choshu alliance, once bitter enemies, now sat side by side with a common goal: to overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate. But not through rebellion or lawless violence, rather, in the name of the emperor, in the name of the court, in the name of a rightful authority stolen 3 centuries ago. Meiji, though he had never held a sword, agreed, not with an official decree, but through silent assent, a nod, a look of approval. And that was enough to unleash a political earthquake. In January 1868, an imperial edict was issued. The Tokugawa shogunate was to be abolished. Bearing the emperor's name and the court's seal, what had once been unthinkable was now lawful. The imperial army, in reality, forces of the Satsuma Choshu alliance, marched into Edo, and within weeks, a 300-year-old era came to an end, quieter than many had imagined. No rivers of blood spilled through the capital. No palaces went up in flames. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, chose to withdraw rather than wage a bloody war. A new chapter of Japanese history turned, not with a clash of steel, but through the quiet consensus of those who understood the old world could no longer be saved. And on that page, for the first time, the name Meiji was written not merely as a title, but as a beginning. Tearing away the golden brocade, the first great reform. When the dust of the old regime settled, what remained was not a strong Japan, but a weary land, torn between 2 eras. In the newly built palace, where the scent of fresh timber still lingered in the walls and maps were redrawn with Western ink, Emperor Meiji sat before a pile of chaotic reports like a new student. Yet behind those eyes, centuries of history were being ripped apart, layer by layer. No one teaches an emperor how to be a reformer. No one hands him a formula for trading the past for the future without spilling blood. But that did not stop Meiji and his companions from acting. In just a few short years, decisions once deemed unthinkable were made, coldly, cleanly, without looking back. The Han system, the backbone of the feudal age, was abolished. The samurai class, once the warrior soul of Japan, was stripped of its privileges, disarmed, and erased by a few lines of imperial decree. Court garments changed from kimono to Western suits. The lunar calendar was replaced with the Gregorian. The era name remained Meiji, but the passing years were now counted beneath the sunset of the East. And the people, from peasants in remote Tohoku to merchants in bustling Osaka, from disgraced swordsmen to stubborn scholars, felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Some wept for the loss of ancestral status. Some rejoiced at the birth of a freer Japan. Others stood silent, unsure of where they now belonged. Meiji still said little. He let his ministers carry out the reforms, but all knew that no decision passed without his signature. This young emperor, who had grown up in the echo of ceremonial bells, was now leading an entire nation out of a 300-year-old box. Amid the whirlwind of change, Japan did not descend into chaos. On the contrary, it moved forward faster than any other nation in Asia at the time. With a resolve as cold as steel, Meiji chose not to cling to the embroidered finery of the past, even though he himself was born of that tradition. And as the iron ships arrived, the first factories exhaled smoke, and Western-style schools opened their gates, no one could deny. A new nation was taking shape, not imposed by foreigners, but forged by the Japanese themselves. Not by the sword, but by the courage to cast aside fading glory. Not with blood, but with the quiet pain of a people remaking themselves from the ground up. Steel, smoke, and the open sea, when Japan raised its eyes to the world. In ancient paintings, the emperor was often depicted as a divine figure, seated high above the clouds, detached from the affairs of the mortal world. But Meiji, after leading his nation through the threshold of the Restoration, became increasingly grounded in reality. In factories, barracks, warships, and even the ink-stained treaties that wavered between honor and survival. In 1873, when Japan declared the implementation of universal conscription, villages across the country trembled. Young farm boys who had never left their rice fields were summoned to military service. Instead of wielding sickles, they were taught to carry rifles, march in European formation, and shout the slogans of a new nation. The old samurai class looked on with dismay. Warrior honor now belonged to commoners, but the current of the era would not slow for their discontent. Weapons factories rose. Railroads stretched across the land. Telegraphs buzzed between Tokyo and Yokohama. Japan entered the age of smoke and steel, where speed mattered more than ceremony and results outweighed ancestry. Meiji was neither an engineer, nor a general, nor a businessman. But he became the symbol of a Japan learning to grow strong, not to defend itself, but to reclaim a place of its own on the world map. Then, in 1894, the moment arrived. The Qing dynasty, once the grand celestial empire of the East, had grown feeble and corrupt. A conflict in Korea erupted, and Japan, after 2 decades of reform, sent its troops onto the international battlefield for the first time. The First Sino-Japanese War began, not just a contest of arms, but a bold declaration. Japan was no one's pupil anymore. Within months, Japanese forces shattered the Beiyang fleet, seized Port Arthur, and forced the Qing to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Korea was removed from Chinese influence. Taiwan was ceded to Japan. And, for the first time in over 1,000 years, an Asian nation had defeated Imperial China on the battlefield. It was a victory of rifles and ironclads, but also a victory of vision. Of a Meiji who never drew a sword, never stepped onto a battlefield, yet from his cold, shadowed throne, reshaped the axis of history with rare patience and resolve. Behind the velvet curtain, loneliness in glory. When people speak of Emperor Meiji, they often speak of his reforms: the first railroads, Western-style schools, banks, warships, and the unprecedented victories that forever altered the face of the East. But few ever ask, what did the man behind it all think when night fell? Meiji outlived most of those who had once opposed him. He also lived long enough to see many of his closest allies, men like Saigo Takamori and Ito Hirobumi, fall, one by one, to the shifting tides of the very age he had ushered in. The throne remained, but it was no longer the mystic seat hidden behind curtains, as it had been under the Tokugawa. Now the emperor had become a national institution, a living emblem bound by ritual, from the moment he opened his eyes to the moment he closed them. He was the spirit of the nation, and for that reason, perhaps, he ceased to be merely a man. In the newly built imperial palace at the heart of Tokyo, a city risen from the ashes of old Edo, Meiji walked between stone walls, European columns, and gardens trimmed in the English style. He read reports, reviewed policy, received Western envoys, always punctual, always composed. But few ever saw the smile that once belonged to the bold youth who had dreamt of a Japan standing shoulder to shoulder with the great powers. Sometimes, on winter nights, he would summon the old servants who had lived with him in Kyoto, not to discuss affairs of state, but to hear them recount the sounds of the old capital, the scent of incense in the Kintan halls, the drifting notes of a flute echoing from Gion Gate. No one dared to ask why he needed those things. Perhaps deep within, the man who had led Japan into a new age was still that lonely boy once hidden behind a screen when the fires of revolution first broke out. In 1912, Emperor Meiji passed away in silence. There was no coup, no uprising, just a July morning when the man who had stood at the center of every transformation over the past half-century did not wake up. His funeral became the first state ceremony to combine ancient Japanese rites with Western-style formalities. Even in death, he remained a symbol of the convergence between East and West.
Thank you all for following and listening. If you enjoyed and found it interesting, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for our upcoming videos.